Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Demina Malord. I am a licensed mental health counselor, an anxiety and fear relief coach, and an individual who is passionate about growing within self and sharing the knowledge. Welcome. If this is your first time here, so thankful to have you in this safe space. If you've been here before, so glad that you have made your way back. In today's video, we will be talking about can you stop feeling guilty? And really, the series, and this is the first video in the series, is how can you overcome guilt? So, this is a topic that I find comes up a lot when I'm interacting with people, sharing and talking, even with clients in sessions. This is a general topic that tends to come up a lot. And it tends to come up a lot simply because, for one, it's just one of the many emotions that we all can experience, right? Similar to happiness or joy or sadness or being annoyed or irritated, we can also feel guilty. And so, what can happen a lot of the time is that the feeling of guilt and having to sit with what that literally feels like, right, within your mind and your body can be so unpleasant and so uncomfortable that what can happen is that very naturally, right, if something is uncomfortable or unpleasant, if we're not used to it, or if we just want to stop feeling that, we will do whatever we may need to do in order to not have to feel that feeling. And so I really wanted us to dig into it today. And really, the first video really just talk about, right, like, can you stop feeling guilty? And if you can, how can you do that? So just to kind of start the video off, I wanted to share a definition of guilt that I received from someone. And the definition that I have, and it's in my opinion, it's such a solid definition, is when your actions do not match up to your values. And I want to just take a moment to let that breathe, right? Again, when your actions do not match up to your values. Because every single one of us has a value system. And very likely each one of us has a set of value systems depending on the setting that we might be in, right? So for example, if you have a value of loyalty towards people that you love and care about and hold near and dear to you, then you might be more inclined to say yes to doing something or to helping maybe a family member or a friend more so than you probably would a stranger, right? Because the value there is to be loyal, is to be helpful, is to show care and to be there. And so, again, maybe in another situation, right? Maybe in a work setting, depending on what your position is, your value may be simply just to show up to work, right? Like you might be one of those people in the work setting that consistently comes to work. You're not really one of those people that take sick days. You don't really take mental health days, right? You are super consistent. Like you are one of those people that will likely outwork, anyone else in the office because you're so consistent in being there and being present, physically present, right? And I imagine that can also count even if you work remotely. So let's take that definition and those scenarios and kind of put it into practice as far as how guilt can feel, manifest, show itself, how we can experience it in our mind and in our physical bodies. So if we go back to the example of you being that person, right, who's super loyal, always there, consistent. Let's say you are going through something. Maybe you're going through a breakup, or maybe your health has taken a dip, right? And it doesn't necessarily even have to be anything like super duper major. Maybe it's just the cold, or you have the flu, or let's say you work in a setting where you are talking to people, right? You're literally using your voice. And for some reason, you've lost your voice. Maybe you have strep throat, right? Maybe something is going on where you're not able to do what you typically and consistently do because something has come up that's more of a pressing matter that needs to be addressed, more or less, right? So a lot of times when I am chatting with people, and sometimes this is even true for myself, is that, right, if I, or maybe someone I'm chatting with, right, deviate, which basically means, right, like do something different than what one typically does, right? So if you're consistently there, you consistently show up to work. Maybe you're a student, right? You consistently show up to classes, study hall, all of that. Or if you're that person in your family who consistently is always there, right? Somebody needs something, you're there, no matter what time in the day, no matter what day, right? If something comes up that's more pressing, truly, right, like your health, sometimes what can happen is that, factually speaking, right, especially let's say if you're sick, if you have the cold, if you have the flu, and you literally, your body is communicating with you, hey, I need rest. I need to relax. I need to get more sleep. I need to get more nutrients in my body. I don't need to be around people, right? And that's your body communicating with you. A lot of times, what can happen is that um, that kind of a situation can conflict with that initial value that probably has been a general priority, right? Again, going back to you being that person that is consistent, always shows up, always there. And so, what can happen is that there is a concept in the field of mental health called black and white thinking, right? Where it's either this or it's either that. It's either black or it's either white. And the reality is that, kind of going back to the beginning of the video, is that when we have a value system or a set of values, very naturally and actually, generally speaking, we may have different sets of values for different settings, different people, places, or things. So, for example, you're the one that's living in your body, right? No one else has lived in your body. No one else knows all the experiences that you've had, like in total. And so, if you know that for you, let's say, right, one of the things that helps you to stay consistent as far as showing up for others, showing up to work, showing up to school, right, doing all of your tasks, doing all the things you need to do. If maybe a value of yours or a pillar of yours, as it relates to managing your health, if that is, in a sense, set in your mind as a lower priority, that can be where the conflict comes into play. So, for example, again, right, going back to, let's say you're down for the count, right? Like, we are human, we are not robots. Even though sometimes in society and different settings, maybe in the workplace, maybe with family, right, there might be the expectation. Maybe within yourself, you might have that expectation. I've got to be 100%. Maybe you even know realistically, right, that you can't be all things or do all things. But the reality is that, right, sometimes when we have that black and white thinking happening, right, we may think, oh my gosh, if I don't, I'm sick right now. I have the cold, I have the flu, I have strep throat, right? Maybe something's going on with your mood, right? Maybe you're just not up to it. Maybe you're feeling super sad, you're feeling blue, you're going through a depressive episode. Maybe your anxiety is super high, right? You just need to be relaxed in your safe spaces, right? Again, because of that conflicting thinking in our minds, right? And where we place certain priorities and certain values, it may conflict, right? You may know and feel, man, I really need to rest, but I've got to get to work. I've got to hold my promises. One of my values is that, I want to be at work 100%. I want to be at school 100%. And part of the reason why I wanted to do this video is to really break down how guilt plays a role in that. So again, going back to that definition of guilt being when your actions do not match up or add up to your values, that can really play that how do I say it? That can really affect how we handle certain matters. So, for example, right, you're sick. You know it's best for you to just rest at home, right? Even if it's for half a day, even if it's for a whole day. Maybe you need a couple of days, right? So obviously it's going to be case by case. Let's say if you have a cold, or let's say you have the flu, right? Not too long ago, I had the flu and it was horrible. I do not wish that on anyone because in my opinion, there's nothing worse than when you don't feel your best or when you don't feel close to your best because it really, it can be annoying. It can really be annoying. I don't know if anyone would agree with me, but it can be annoying because if you have stuff you want to do, if you have things you got to do as an adult, right? We've got to run errands and things. And maybe it's just there's an event that's coming up that you and your friends signed up for and you've been looking forward to it for the longest. And, something has come up with your health. You've got the cold, you've got the flu, you've got something that comes up that essentially is placed as more priority. It can be super frustrating or annoying to be like, oh man, I have to deal with this thing. Um, and so sometimes what can happen is that, right, if maybe you decide, okay, I'm going to, manage my health first. I'm going to take care of my health first, right? So if you kind of rearrange your values a little bit, sometimes the after effect, right? So in action, right? Let's say you decide to stay home and relax. Okay, so you've done the thing that you know is best to do, but then there's the after effects. Then you're at home, you're relaxed. Your brain and your body, right? There's muscle memory essentially, right? So let's say if it's a Tuesday at 11:30 a.m. and you're typically in class or you're typically at school, right? Tuesdays at 11 there's a staff meeting, and at 11:30 you're laying in your bed watching a show purposefully because you're resting, right? But what can naturally happen is that, right, if it's not something that you're typically used to doing, there can oftentimes people can have those thoughts come into their mind like, oh my gosh, did I make the right decision? I should be at the meeting right now. I should be in class. I'm missing the material. What if they're going over something super important? Man, I really needed to talk about or to bring up XYZ matter. We're short staffed. I know I need to be there, right? Like thoughts like that can come into our minds, which can cause that conflict and can bring about feelings of guilt. And that doesn't even count if you have, let's say, a coworker or a supervisor or a family member who might be blowing up your phone, right? Who might be texting you, who might be trying to reach out to you to say, hey, I know you're not feeling well, but is there any way you can even make it out for 15 minutes or 30 minutes, right? So sometimes the pressure, the request, maybe pressure is not the best word for you, right? Change it around in the way that works. Maybe the request of others makes you feel pressured or makes you feel like you need to change your course of action, right? Which would be instead of resting at home or resting at a safe place, right? Like powering through when you know your body or your mind needs that downtime, right? And so I want to just talk a little bit about how sometimes with guilt, let me just quickly look at my notes. Sometimes with guilt, it can present what it's called is as a learned social emotion. So there is a concept, not sure if you've heard of it. It's called groupthink. And the definition of groupthink is the practice of thinking or making decisions as a group in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. And so, as you're considering that definition, as I mentioned it, right? Let's say again, right? Maybe it's in the professional setting. Maybe you're a supervisor, right? Maybe you're used to being there. Maybe you're used to putting in so much overtime, right? And always being there. If something comes up that you have to address, and it doesn't even have to be your health, right? Maybe it's the health of a family member, of a spouse, of a child, right? Maybe you have a different situation going on, right? Um, what can happen is that sometimes what can motivate people to do the thing that may not necessarily be best for them individually might be the thought of not wanting to be ridiculed, not wanting to be outcast, not wanting to be the person on the chopping block, not wanting to be talked about, not wanting to be gossiped about. And I mention that because that's such an important part of not only how we experience our emotions, but how, within different group settings, that can also affect how we decide to move, how we decide to act, the behaviors that we have. And the main thing is that I want to just share, right? So going back to the beginning of the video, with the title, which is for part one of this series, can I stop feeling guilty? Can you stop feeling guilty? And I want to just share, right? So remember earlier I talked about the black and the white thinking, right? So if we use that concept as it relates to the question, can I stop being guilty? So black or white to me would be you can either stop feeling guilty or you can not stop feeling guilty. If we go with the black and white thinking, that doesn't really give you much option. However, if you consider that question within a spectrum, okay, giving you options, right, giving you some breathing room, again, the reality is that, and you might even be able to speak to this if you think about some examples in your own personal life, is that there are times when you can experience an emotion, but you may not experience that emotion 100%. Or you may experience one emotion and another emotion simultaneously. So, for example, there's a phrase called bittersweet. Man, so I'll use this as an example, right? Maybe you are, I don't know, this is just a random example, right? Maybe you go to a wedding and maybe you're single and you're at the wedding and it's beautiful and it brings up emotions in you that make you feel happy for the couple, right? Maybe just the energy of the wedding, right? You get to dress up, right? Depending on the wedding, you get to dress up, right? It's like, there's the vibe there and it's like, this is so nice. But maybe because you're single, maybe because you attended the wedding alone, maybe, you're in a relationship, but you guys are going through it. Maybe you might be feeling happiness for the couple, right? But then you might also be feeling sad, maybe for yourself, maybe wishing that you could have that kind of happiness in the moment, but not because maybe you're conflicting, you're in conflict with your partner, or, you're like, man, I don't want to be alone, right? When I think about that example, I think about the phrase or the word bittersweet. Sometimes things can be bitter and they can be sweet simultaneously. And so, specifically as it relates to guilt, right? So, can you stop feeling guilty? Uh, in my opinion, the reality is that the better way to answer that question would be that you can learn how to decrease the intensity of the feeling of guilt. Okay. So, if we're thinking about it from a spectrum, right? Let's say that typically on average, depending on your values, depending on what you view to be important, right? Always being there for others, always being consistent at work, at school, right? Never taking a moment off because you want to be top tier, right? You want to achieve. Maybe for you, you're used to experiencing the intensity of guilt in times of conflict where you may have to choose yourself or choose something that you wouldn't maybe normally choose. Maybe the intensity of the emotion you're feeling is like an 8.5 out of 10, which for you might be unbearable, just might not be pleasant, right? Um, you might hear some noise in the background. There is some work being done, so hopefully you can hear me okay. Right? So then if you have an idea of the average, right, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being total complete guilt, like you just don't know what to do with yourself, versus 1, which is I'm good. I'm cool, calm, collected. Maybe for you, right? If you know that your average is like an 8.5 out of 10, I encourage you to consider, okay, what could be a doable and realistic level of emotional intensity that you can work with, that you can manage, that can be doable. Knowing that guilt is likely an emotion that you don't want to experience at all, because I raised my hand to that, right? Like, it's okay to know that, you know, like it's okay to say that you don't want to experience an emotion, right? And also to know that it can be super annoying to experience a certain emotion because it might knock you off your game, right? It might distract you from something more important. So an example that I came up with would be, okay, so if the average for you is an 8.5 out of 10, maybe the new goal on average could be experiencing guilt at a 4.5 out of 10, right? So what would that look like? That would look like doing some work, right? Like putting some strategy together, either by working with a mental health professional, a life coach, right? Reading some self-help books, reading blog articles, podcasts, YouTube videos, audiobooks, right? So many resources now to help you really get familiar with the feeling of guilt. What does guilt even mean, right? Like understanding it on a deeper level other than how you feel it in your mind and your body when it initially comes upon you, because what can happen is that for those of us who experience emotions maybe more intensely than others, or if we experience an emotion that we really don't know exactly what to do with, sometimes it can take us under like a wave. And so, part of the reason why I'm doing this series is because in the clients that I've been speaking to, and just generally, right, like in conversations that I have in life, guilt is an emotion that people don't really know what to do with, and it can make them feel super uncomfortable to the point where, it's like there's a practice of avoidance, right? Like, I'm going to avoid this feeling and I'm just going to do what I need to do to get through it. But what can be unproductive about that is the fact that if you find that guilt is an emotion that you push away or you avoid, right? You may have very good reason to, right? So I'm not knocking. What can happen is that the amount of distress that it can cause you in different areas in your life can just increase over time, to the point where you may not even recognize it, but you may experience the intensity of the emotion at a 10 out of 10. However, the situation only calls for the feeling and the intensity to really be a 3 out of 10. But that's really hard to be able to like put into practice if you haven't put it into practice. You really have to retrain your mind, and it doesn't have to be in a sad way, right? You can use creativity, right? You can use strategy. You can shift and tweak and shift and tweak and shift and tweak in a way that helps you to manage the uncomfortableness of it, right? And so, that those are just some thoughts that I wanted to share with you as this first video in this series. And what I want to share is that in the next video, I will be going over 3 realistic and doable tips to help you decrease the intensity of the feeling. So I mentioned a couple things today, but I'm going to be taking a deeper dive, right? And so hopefully this series will be able to help you truly gain an understanding and just more familiarity. Notice I didn't say comfort, because sometimes we just don't feel comfortable with things. We just have to kind of get familiar with it and just let it be what it is. Yet and still, you are able to manage and shift and tweak and restructure in a realistic and in a doable way for yourself. In the meantime, take a look at my show notes. Follow me on social media. Definitely listen to my podcast, Grow Through This. You will see the link in the show notes again, and contact me with any questions. Definitely keep your head up. Thank you for watching and listening. Definitely, again, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell. And it was a pleasure. Talk to you soon. Bye.